Hey guys, how are you? So I'm off camera here because I want to quickly cover this subject. I've tried this many times to get it right. We're going to try again. The more organized and the better version is actually found on the courses, on my WebStack courses. But I'm going to give you a quick overview here because this is something that I think some people are going to want to learn. So this is for beginners. So if you're somebody who's done my courses already, you know this, no problem, so you don't have to worry about it. So I'm putting this out there just for the YouTube community in general. So we're going to look at front end versus back end, client side versus server side, and full stack. These are terms that you probably heard. So bear with me as we go through some of these concepts because for beginners, a little bit challenging. You have two types of computers out there. You have client computers, your smartphone, your laptop, your desktop. These are client computers. And on the flip side, on the opposite end, you have something called the server computer. What's the difference between a client computer and the server computer? Well, in terms of the hardware, there's not much of a difference. These days, any computer can be a client or a server computer. It has to do with their role. A client computer is basically a computer that's asking for information from a server computer, and a server computer is just sending that information out to the client computer. That's pretty much the difference between a client computer and a server computer. Server computers serve out information, client computers request information. So when we're talking about the World Wide Web, when we're talking about client computers, we're talking about, as I said, your smartphone, your laptop, your desktop, whatever. And it becomes a client computer when it surfs to a website. So you pull out your smartphone or your tablet and you go to YouTube. And by going to YouTube, you're actually asking the YouTube servers, because the YouTube website, all the code and all the videos have to be on server computers. Typically it's on many server computers because it's a huge site. And so when you go to YouTube, your web browser, because you're surfing with Internet Explorer, Chrome, well, not Internet Explorer, but Chrome, Firefox, Safari. When you're surfing the web with your web browser and you go to a website, you're basically a client, because when you do go to a website, you're literally, well, not you, but your web browser behind the scenes is literally sending information to the server. What information is it sending? It's sending request information. It's literally saying, hey, can you please send me your web pages? Can you please send me your video? And the server computer serves up that information to the web browser, whatever the web browser happens to be requesting. As I said, you could be requesting video, images, articles, etc. So when nerds talk about client side versus server side, they're talking about client side computers, like any desktop, and they're talking about server side. And what they're also talking about is client side apps. A client side app is an app that lives inside of your typical home computer, laptop, smartphone. And a server side app or program is an application, a piece of software that sits on the server. So the big difference between, well, one of the big differences between server side computers and client side computers is that the server-side computer has server software installed on it. And all that server software does, it sits there and it processes requests from client-side computers. So you got client-side, server-side. You can think of this as an interaction. This is one side of the interaction. This is the other side of the interaction. Client-side, server-side. So the next thing we got to look at is the code. The code. Now you have client-side code, HTML, CSS, JavaScript. These are client-side languages. And you have server-side languages like Python. JavaScript, actually, it's a little faded here, but JavaScript is one of the few languages that run on both the client side and the server side. PHP, SQL, C#, Ruby, Java, many other languages as well. So people will talk about client-side languages, HTML, CSS, JavaScript. Now you know what they're talking about. These are languages that actually run on the client computers, desktop, your laptop, your smartphone, your iPad. And server-side languages are actual languages that run on the server computers. What do I mean when I say the languages run on the server-side computer or they run on a client-side computer? All these languages, whether it be HTML, CSS, JavaScript, Python, JavaScript, PHP, SQL, Java, Ruby, etc., all these languages have to be processed. Now, a lot of them are processed by a dedicated program that reads and understands the code. It reads and understands the HTML and the CSS and JavaScript code. Each of these languages have their own programs that can read and understand the languages. So when you're writing HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, or PHP and Python, etc., you're, in a nutshell, you are essentially sending instructions to the computer. You're telling the computer what to do. So when you're writing HTML, you're telling the computer what to display in a web page. When you're writing CSS, you're telling the computer how to display things in the web page, how to color the text, how to position an image on the page, etc. When you're writing JavaScript, you're giving your page a kind of intelligence, if you will. You're giving it an ability to do things, like somebody clicks on a button or somebody scrolls down the page. You can use JavaScript to do stuff when things happen. So basically, when you're writing code, you're sending instructions to the computer. These languages need some sort of software to be able to read and understand these instructions that are contained within the different languages. So the question that comes to my mind, why do you got different languages? I've answered this in other videos, but basically each language has its own specialty, something that it does better than the others. Also, software developers, nerds will have different points of view about what's the best way to do something. What's the best way to have a programming language work? So they write their own language. That's a big part of it. We can leave it at that. So we're making progress here. We got the client side. We know what that is. We know client-side languages like HTML, CSS, JavaScript. We know about the server side. We know that servers are just computers that wait to serve out information. We know that server computers have software installed on there that sit there to wait to serve information. You can think of this interaction between client-side computers and server-side computers just like an interaction between a waiter and a client coming to a restaurant. When you come to a restaurant and you order some food, that's making a request. You're requesting information. You're requesting food. And your waiter, French we call waiter serveur, the waiter will serve that food to you. And that's what the nerds are thinking about when they came up with the idea of the client computer or the client side software versus server side. Server software serves information, client software requests information. Our next term, front end, back end. Back end, I think it's obvious. Behind the scenes of every website in the world, you have code that runs on the server, and they call that the back end. It's not the back end of things. And code, like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, but are running in your web browser, they call that the front end because it's on the front of the transaction, if you will. I hope that makes sense. So now you understand what there's between front end, back end, back end is server, front end is client, computers, and software. You understand there's between front-end languages like HTML, CSS, JavaScript. Some people call them client-side languages because they're client computers. They run on the client computers. And then you got the server computers. And you have the server-side languages. Now, sometimes the lines are blurred, like JavaScript can be both run on the client computer and on the server computers. Generally speaking, though, languages, whether it be Python, JavaScript, PHP, SQL, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, whatever, generally speaking, languages will be favored to run in one environment or another. So typically speaking, well, HTML, CSS is just client side. It always stays on the client. Python can be run on the client, but most of the time it's run on the server. You get the idea. So there's always exceptions to rules and everything in life, including where programming languages run. So finally, we have front-end developers. Front-end developers, you guessed it, they work on these languages, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and they develop the front end, the visual aspect of your websites, the visual aspects of your web apps. They deal with the front end. And then you have back-end developers. They deal with the code and the structuring of apps from the back end of things. So to be writing PHP, JavaScript, Python, SQL, C#, you get the idea. So now you understand the difference between the front-end developer and the back-end developer, what roles they play, what kind of code they write. And finally, you have the full stack. The full stack developer does both front-end and back-end coding. So there you have it. That was the whole point. So you've learned front-end, back-end, client-side, server-side, and full stack.